Good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, April 20th, 2020, and welcome to our fourth installment of Murray Men on Politics. My name is Keir Murray. I'm a public affairs and political consultant based here in Houston, and I'm joined by longtime University of Houston political scientist and also my dad, Dr. Richard Murray. Dad, how are you today?
I'm just fine.
Good. We usually begin these by taking stock of where we are in now several weeks into this ongoing health and economic crisis. By latest read, I believe in the U.S. we have approaching 800,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19. Likely, of course, many more than that have not been documented. We're nearing, sadly, 42,000 fatalities in the United States, just a staggering number. And I think under approaching 4 million Americans have been tested, which may sound good, but in a country whose population is 330 million people, we're barely scratching 1% of the population being tested there. Just generally speaking, what's your sense of where we are in week 5 or whatever this is of this crisis?
Well, I'm impressed by the incredible velocity of events moving so fast on so many different fronts. Economically, the health front, the conflict between the states and Washington, trying to start very small baby steps to reopening selected parts of the economy. So it's just normally in an election year, presidential year, we'd be wrapping up the primaries. Well, we shut those down, but just about everything else is going at warp speed.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that later. I think, we'd be remiss if we sit here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to not mention this sort of cataclysmic collapse in the price of oil today. The futures price for May of West Texas Intermediate, I believe, is closed at negative $37 a barrel. I was checking that to see if it was a typo. It's the first time in history, I believe, that price has gone negative. What that says, I think, is that there's an oversupply of oil. Places like Cushing, Oklahoma, that are huge storage capacity there is now basically full. And there's a demand problem with the contraction of the global economy. People are using a lot less oil to drive cars and other things than they normally might. And of course, for a state like ours, it's heavily dependent upon that industry. It's potentially catastrophic effects. Why don't we talk a little bit about the price of oil and what that can potentially mean for the state of Texas in terms of how revenue is generated to fund things like our schools, as well as a city like we live in, Houston, where it's such a major part of our local economy.
It's a body blow without question. In the past, we've had some of these crises around energy. Sometimes they actually work to Texas' benefit, like when the price of oil went up sharply in 1973 and 74, triggered a national recession, but that higher prices were basically a boon to Houston and Texas. Now, besides this worldwide pan-epidemic and the economic collapse, we're going exactly even deeper in the hole and very quickly, because our economy here in Texas is so incredibly dependent upon energy, lots of employment. So, we'll talk about the political impact of this later, but it's got to have some effect politically in our state because it's going to have huge ramifications down the road, and we'll see how it plays out in November.
Right. And of course, the state of Texas operates on a biennium budget. Every 2 years, the legislature in the odd years sets the budget for the next 24 months. And as we know, the state's economic stabilization fund, referred to often as the rainy day fund, is filled by oil and gas severance tax. And I believe the state has $9 or $10 billion in that fund at the moment. But looking down the road from a funding standpoint for the legislature, what could be the long-term implications of a just a devastating cut to this oil and gas revenue that the state depends so heavily upon?
Well, we're kind of pro-states' rights, criticize the federal government political entity historically, but we're going to take our Big Ten cup to Washington. There's no way we can fund state government going forward into the next biennium without a huge infusion of funds from the federal treasury.
Yeah, and as you say, we have the direct potential effects on employment. But I think about here in a city like Houston, restaurants and car dealers and people in the travel business, all these folks who rely on the disposable income of folks who have done well in the energy industry. It has potentially this rippling effect economically on a community like ours that could have devastating consequences, it seems to me.
Yeah, in some sense, we're probably fortunate that we don't depend upon an income tax, because incomes are collapsing around the country, and states that rely heavily upon that revenue source are going to get hit hard too. But we do rely very heavily on sales taxes, and people staying home aren't out spending money, and people who don't have jobs aren't going to be spending money in the next year or two. So we have some buffer because of our lack of an income tax, but we're going to be hugely in the hole. We're going to need tens of billions of dollars to keep our basic operations running.
And let's talk about that process. Early days, obviously the Congress has approved a couple of short-term lifeline cash infusions, the second one quite large, and we're apparently working on another now. How do you see that process playing out for, getting both houses of Congress and the president together to come to agreement on how you just make the decision to borrow and spend more money, and how that will be allocated potentially in the future?
Well, Congress is acting now in ways that it historically has not done much of the last year or two, because the folks realize if they don't respond to this crisis, a lot of them are going to get fired in November, including perhaps the president. So you've got this, and the president, to his benefit in this crisis, I think, is not much of an ideologue. He doesn't care a lot about balancing budgets and so forth and so on. So he's deputized the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin, to bargain with the Democrats, and they're striking some deals. They don't go down very well with congressional Republicans. They're sort of been to a great degree sidelined here, but these folks all want to survive. So we'll get some stuff done. One of the problems we have in the short run is because of the virus, members are not eager to get back to Washington in person. So to pass stuff right now, basically you have to have unanimous consent. Any member of the Senate particularly can block any deal they strongly object to. That's really hard to do. Right now, again, the Washington, D.C. is in the middle of this crisis. The nature of politics is you're exposed to an awful lot of people. Several members of Congress have already been found to have been infected. So we'll keep getting some stuff done, but it's probably a good thing that you've got a rather non-ideological president right now who's willing to go trillions of dollars into debt, which most economists say you have to do. But a lot of traditional conservative Republicans are very unhappy at this sharp left turn, as they see it, where we're going to run up the deficit by about $5 or $6 trillion in the next year.
Pretty soon we'll be talking about real money.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm struck by the degree to which both Republican leaders in Congress, Mitch McConnell in the Senate and Kevin McCarthy in the U.S. House from California, have just disappeared in recent weeks.
Well,
You don't
McConnell,
hear a
of course,
peep out of them.
McConnell is up for election himself. Republicans expected to pretty easily retain control of the Senate. That's very much in play now. The House looks like it's probably not winnable back. But McConnell, above all else, really likes being the Senate Majority Leader. He's not interested in being defeated himself, of course, but also in being returned to minority status, which is at real risk now. Even here in Texas, John Cornyn now is increasingly at some risk. Democrats don't have a nominee yet, but they will get one in a few weeks. And Texas, because of the slam that we're taking, anybody that's an incumbent in the governing party, and that's the Republican Party, is at some considerable risk here. Historically, when there's an economic collapse, voters at the margins show up who normally don't vote and vote against the people who are running things.
Yeah, and that brings me. I kind of want to talk about this clear tension that exists, and for understandable reasons, where you've got ongoing health uh, crisis, folks getting sick and unfortunately perishing. At the same time, you've got this economic collapse going on, and it's created this tension in our federalized system of 50 states where you've got different responses from different governors in the states depending on the situation health wise in their state and their politics and just their general attitude toward this crisis. But the response on that is, I think, is sort of naturally uneven. But you've got some states now agitating to re-engage economically, open things back up for business. The president seems to echo those sentiments. Over the weekend, we saw a number of protests in some states in the Midwest, for example, reminiscent perhaps of the Tea Party from 10 years ago or so, where folks are gathering in front of the Capitol and protesting the shutdown related to COVID and wanting to get the economy back open. How do you see that scenario setting up?
Well, it has some similarities to the Tea Party protest of 10 years ago. Fox News has urged that on. They're leading the charge now, but there are huge differences. Barack Obama, perceived as a very liberal Democratic president, was running things in the White House. It's Donald Trump now. Trump likes to run with the foxes and hunt with the hounds. So he's trying to play this both ways. Earlier in the last week, he was pretty, I thought, responsible in the rollout of the federal three-phase beginning of opening things up. But then within 24 hours, he's basically on Twitter urging the protesters who are not thrilled with the federal government's response that he is overall in charge of. So it's again fascinating. I don't think very many people, of course, are professional economists and don't realize it's a lot easier to shut something down like this than just crank it back up. And you can shut things down in a matter of days, but restarting the American economy in any deep sense is going to take months, if not years, with some sectors perhaps never coming back, like movie theaters, cruise ships, and others like airlines doing so much more slowly.
Yeah, and for one thing, it's always interesting to me when the president's making a comment like, liberate your state in the context of the Second Amendment, based on what we saw happen in Charlottesville a couple of years ago at pretty troubling rhetoric. But the other interesting piece of this is that I saw some polling this morning, I think from YouGov, that was taking public attitudes over the last couple of days about these protests. And they found overwhelmingly Americans, just 20% or so, were in favor of these protests, and most opposed them, including a substantial majority of Republicans. I think over 60% of Republicans I saw in the survey thought these were a bad idea. And we've seen in a number of polls in recent weeks, the public's attitude is pretty firm that they would prefer to see more confidence on the health side of this crisis before putting the cart before the horse and opening the economic system, turning that spigot back on. So it seems to me the president's on some tricky ground here, trying to galvanize these protesters. It's not a very popular position with the American public.
To remind, even before we started formally shutting down the economy, consumers were doing it themselves. People had stopped booking flights, restaurant bookings dropped off sharply. So you can, if you like the metaphor, the light switch, you can hit the switch. But if millions of Americans continue to be very uncomfortable about going out, not maintaining social distance, nothing's going to change that dramatically. People are not going to approach any semblance of normality until there's relative confidence that they and their families are safe.
Well, I think too, particularly interesting in the context of some of these protesters and the whole idea of social distancing, it's that this concept of individual responsibility is one thing, but it's the idea that your behavior, if it's less than what's recommended can potentially have adverse health consequences for others, right? Because of coming into contact with other people. So it's not just that if you're choosing not to observe these recommended measures, that you're just doing so at your own risk, you're potentially endangering other people. And I think that probably complicates this problem for the public as well.
Well, we're about 5 weeks into this, series of close downs, and a lot of, tens of millions of people have faithfully followed the instructions. They stayed home. They maintained social distance. They've got skin in the game. If you see you're making and your families are making these sacrifices, and you have other people that are ignoring these restrictions, you're not going to feel too happy toward them. Uh, you know, we really are in this together. Epidemics have a particularly virulent dynamic, and you can't be an individual actor. And most people, have some reasonable support for the Second Amendment and gun rights, but if you're talking about life and death, that's a little bit different.
Yeah, well, and not to mention that, this whole idea that everybody wants the economy to get back going. This is not good for anybody, what's going on these days. But I think there's a very real notion that if you jump the gun on this stuff, so to speak, and open things up too quickly, you risk a resurgence of the virus that then will then force you to shut everything down again. You have to start over. And so I think, some people at least, I think, are trying to take the longer view here, which is that we got to suffer in the short term and try to get this over with in some reasonable period of time, at least with it to a severe degree. So then we can really resume things without the high risk of being thrown right back into this situation a month or two down the line.
Well, of course, nobody is alive today that remembers much about what happened in 1918, which is the most similar situation in our history. But that outbreak, again, started in the spring, tailed off in about this time of year, April, May, then came back with a vengeance in September, October, and that's when most of the people died. If we have any track at all like that, that would be tied to reopening too soon, we would really fire just about everybody in public office.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, as we've talked about in the past, this crisis has raised real questions about the process of voting in the country, in these primaries that we've seen interrupted, as well as the upcoming general election in November. When we met last week, the primary election had controversially gone ahead in Wisconsin, but we did not yet have the results. They were announced last Monday evening. Very interesting set of results there. For context, it's pretty clear that the Republican legislature and state Supreme Court in Wisconsin wanted to push this election forward because they had, in addition to the primary election going on, they had an election for a state Supreme Court seat that they wanted to hold. And these are 10-year terms on that court. And I think we're operating under the assumption that if they went forward with the election, it would benefit their candidate. He ended up being blown out by the progressive woman running against him by double digits. And I think I sent a sort of twofold message. Rick Hasson, the election law expert at the University of California, Irvine, wrote a piece today about this, saying that what happened in Wisconsin sort of hit Republicans in two ways. Going forward with the election, A, fired up Democrats to turn out and vote who were angry at what had transpired, but B, made it more difficult for their rural, a lot of times older voters in rural Wisconsin who were skittish about voting in person on election day and probably depressed their turnout some. That 1-2 punch knocked them out in this particular election. I'm wondering if you see a cautionary tale there for November and how we proceed with the upcoming election and how the mechanism for voting will be allowed to go forward.
To me, there are not very many laws of human behavior that hold up, but one is, I think, the law of unintended consequences. You do something and you have, an idea of an outcome that you think is going to result. It often does produce a result, but frequently not the one you expected. Sometimes that's huge, like with the communists in 1933 refusing to join with the more centrist democratic elements to stop the Nazis. They had the crazy idea that Hitler would be so bad that we'll come to power. Well, Hitler came in and immediately locked them up and killed them. It didn't quite work out. So as somebody who's been studying voting for many years, vote suppression issues sometimes work. Obviously, they worked after the Civil War when African American males were removed from the political process very effectively. But these days, there are more buffers and safeguards built in, more message capability of getting out. You try to keep people from voting. That very often inspires marginal people to actually show up and vote. If people, somebody are trying to deny you your basic rights, you often react by getting more politically active.
And of course, we've seen here in Texas litigation, both on the state and federal fronts, trying to force the issue of allowing mail ballot voting here in the primary runoffs, which have been, as folks know, rescheduled for July, as well as the November election. I think one of the problems we had in Wisconsin was that the decision by the governor to halt the election came the day before it was happened. A lot of people had already voted early by mail, that sort of thing. This is happening far in advance, but on Friday we had sort of the interesting dynamic of the state district court judge in Austin ruling in favor of the plaintiffs in the state case that yes, fear of contracting COVID or an illness at a polling place constitutes a disability that should allow anyone who wants to request and receive a mail ballot for future elections. Almost simultaneously, our state's attorney general, Ken Paxton, who himself is under felony indictment for securities fraud, has been for several years, issues a letter saying, no, you can't, fear of COVID is not a disability. And if you try to request a mail ballot or you provide someone a mail ballot under those circumstances, you can and will be prosecuted for voter fraud. The federal case, I think, in San Antonio is yet to be litigated, but very interesting issues setting up here between the sort of Republican establishment in Austin and the Democratic Party and other groups who are suing for relief here. What do you make of this here in Texas?
Well, I think it's important that this litigation get going way before the election. One of the principal reasons that the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene was it was literally a last day effort. And there's a law in the books that they decided about 15 years ago, or a case on the book, where the court should not intervene at the last minute. Well, at least the good news is, it's April, the election is not until November. So we ought to hopefully get some kind of resolution of this without the Supreme Court falling back on this precedent that they relied on in this Wisconsin case. In Texas, most of the really populous counties now are controlled by Democrats, including the local election process. The state government remains solidly Republican in Austin. So you got a dynamic here. The people that are responsible for registering voters and running the actual election are now in the most populous counties, Democrats, like here in Harris County and in Fort Bend County. So we've got some likely tensions coming between local authorities that generally want to make voting easier, particularly vote by mail, because that's means you're not going to have big lines on election day if you've got a huge mail ballot program going. And the state government that still seems like the Wisconsin Republicans to want to interpret voting by mail very, very narrowly, which essentially in Texas is open to people who are 65 and older.
Yeah, and I think to me interesting on a couple of fronts. One, back to the Hassan article that I think is particularly relevant to Texas is this idea that by not wanting to allow people the freedom to vote how they choose, that it disadvantaged rural Republican voters. And as we know, in the 2018 election here in Texas, those voters saved Ted Cruz from losing to Beto O'Rourke in the U.S. Senate race. So it seems to me sort of any hindrance to folks like that, members of the Republican base in the state voting, doesn't necessarily benefit them as a party in these statewide and other races. And the second piece of this is the polling on this, is which there have been several in recent weeks, is clear. The American public, large majority of the American public, supports allowing people to vote by mail for any reason. And that includes Republicans as well as Democrats and independents. So politically, this issue is a loser for them, not to mention it has the potential to negatively affect them at the ballot box in terms of the results if those rural voters are inhibited from casting a ballot.
Well, in American elections in the 21st century, there's clearly a strong move toward more vote by mail. 5 states now do it pretty much exclusively, including a very conservative Republican state like Utah. in a competitive state like Colorado. We've not found many problems with millions of people voting, very little evidence of fraud and misconduct. It's very popular with voters. So once you put mail proposals in, it's almost impossible to remove them because voters like it. And politicians ultimately do have to respond to what voters like. But we're approaching an election with there's just so much uncertainty about our economy, about the political leadership in the country, that predicting a November outcome at this point is hazardous. But unless there's something badly wrong with how we run the election, I look for absolutely record turnout in the country and in our state.
Yeah. An interesting, NBC Wall Street Journal had a new poll come out, I think yesterday. And as you know, it's considered a high quality poll. Not all the ones that we see out there are, but it's well regarded. Showed an interesting race for president. I think Biden leading Trump by 7 or 8 points nationally, but they also looked at 11 battleground states, including most of the ones you can tick off: Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, et cetera. And the lead was about the same for Biden in those states. What's your sense of where, we saw a little bit of a rally around the flag bounce for the president, and when this crisis really got going, that looks to have dissipated. Where do you see the state of the race right now?
Advantage Biden because, among other things, the Democrats aren't running the central government. And when you've had an economic collapse at this magnitude, and there have been 2 or 3 in the entire history of the United States, the incumbent party that holds the presidency, particularly if they have at least part of Congress, pays a terrible price. And I don't know that voters are going to respond any differently this year. Biden's not a great candidate in my view. He's an okay candidate. But Trump's, just after having a lot of great luck, I thought, for 3 years, has just gotten about the worst possible deck of cards dealt to him imaginable. He has some benefits. He can usually force his party to accept compromises. He's not ideological. But this would, even if you had an incredibly skilled, managerially oriented president, working through this crisis for the chief executive is just going to be extraordinarily difficult. And the whole playbook that the Republicans were expecting to use, record stock market, were you better off than you were 4 years ago, the old Reagan line from 1984, those things are all out the window. So you're looking at running a very negative campaign that tries to hammer Joe Biden, but negativity doesn't work nearly as well when people are concerned about very fundamental issues like, how am I going to make a living, as opposed to, well, I have my reservations about so-and-so personally.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, re-elections for presidents are usually a referendum on their first term. I think this is that on steroids. It seems to me, Biden has been relatively absent from the national conversation in recent weeks. He's done a few things, but he's been definitely back burner. So it seems to me that the sort of shift in the polling numbers is almost entirely due to how the American public is perceiving the president and his job performance. And, you could maybe put up a crash test dummy as the candidate, and they probably do about the same in the polls at this point.
Yeah, Napoleon famously said, when your enemies are destroying themselves, don't interfere. If you have to go dark and lay low, as Biden has to do in this crisis period and marooned in his home, not a bad time. It minimizes some risk, like you're getting infected out on the trail. Money's going to matter much less in this election than usual for president anyway. Everybody knows Donald Trump. Most people like him or dislike him. That's not going to be easily changed. But we haven't had an election with unemployment over 20% since 1932. And the president at that time was Herbert Hoover, very decent guy. Had a great success in business and was thought of as a very good manager. But in the public's eyes, he had failed to respond effectively. And that's the big question. The president could still rally if he can demonstrate that he can get us at least started out of this deep, deep ditch. But he doesn't have forever to do that.
Yeah, and one interesting nugget I saw from that poll was that had to do with college-educated white voters. And as we know, in 2016, the exit polls suggested that Hillary Clinton lost those voters, not by a lot, but by 4 or 5 points, I think. This
Mm.
poll, the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, had Biden ahead of Trump by close to 15 points among uh, that cohort of the electorate, which I think obviously have potentially profound implications for the presidential result itself, but also for congressional and legislative races in these suburban areas around the country, including here in Texas. As we've discussed in the past, the battle for the Texas House is sort of the marquee fight in the state of Texas. Virtually all of the targeted districts are in the suburbs of the major metro areas of Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and Austin, San Antonio. And if you're getting that kind of hemorrhaging by the president of those voters who had previously been pretty good voters for him and his fellow Republicans, that suggests real trouble potentially in November, even in a state like Texas.
Yeah, and one thing that's a little different about us is we have had much more rapid demographic change since 2010. Uh, we've had a lot of immigration, international and from other states. So our suburban districts were very carefully crafted by the Republicans in 2011. They controlled the process. They did a great job of drawing the districts through what we call a gerrymander, both for Congress and for the state legislature. But there's been so much population growth and movement. A lot of those districts aren't very good anymore. I've just finished working my way through the Katy district that a freshman Democrat represents. From looking at the population shifts and the change in voter registration, I think she's pretty easily reelected in 2020 because the district has changed so dramatically. We have a precinct that had 5,000 voters 2 years ago. It has 8,000 now. Very few of those are white voters. So Texas, which has been on the back burner since 1994, is coming back into focus as a battleground state. And the Texas suburbs like Katy and uh, north of Dallas, around Travis County, like Hayes County. That's the ball game now.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. You mentioned gerrymandering, and sort of the last subject I wanted to cover this afternoon. We saw last week that the Trump administration indicated that they would like to delay the completion of the census, which normally I think would be done by early this fall in time to get numbers ready for the first of the year. They're now talking about not having data until July of 2021. That would have major implications here in Texas for the redrawing of legislative and congressional seats. Our state constitution mandates that the legislature redraw seats during the next regular session of the legislature following a completed census. Well, as we know, the 2021 legislative session, the regular session, will be completed by early June of 2021. If we don't have data, they can't draw maps, which potentially for legislative seats would mean having to wait 2 years until a subsequent legislative session to draw those legislative maps. For congressional seats, I believe they have to draw them more immediately. So it would require either a special session of the legislature later that summer, or a federal court would draw the map, as we've seen done in previous years. What do you make of that situation? What that might mean for how politics in the legislature plays out, not only for this election, but going into the session next year?
Well, Congress is different. We have to redraw Congress because Texas is going to gain 2 new seats, or maybe 3, and you've got to fit them in the map. And that means, because the districts have to be equal in population, you have to do a massive congressional redistricting. No ifs, ands, or buts. You can't run the election in 2022 with these 36 congressional districts when you have 38 or 39 seats. So, as you say, either you call the legislature back into special session, and if the Democrats say control the state house and the Republicans control the Senate, they'll either strike a bargain or the courts will have to do it. But
You still there?